Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jonathan Bloom, the Calderwood Professor, or after Calderwood Professor, here at BC. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this rescheduled lecture on Wahhabism, past and present, by Natana DeLongbos, who is visiting with us this year, and I'm happy to say will be visiting with us next year as well. We have sort of known each other for many years because we worked on a project together that was the Oxford Illustrated History of Islam. But we only corresponded. We didn't really, but you claim that you actually saw me, and we met
in an elevator once.
Yes. Right, exactly. But anyway, we sort of really, Ben Browdy and I met Natana this summer, and we were delighted to be able to bring her to BC. Anyway, she was educated at Middlebury College, where she got a BA in French and international comparative politics, and then moved on to Georgetown, where she earned her PhD in 2002, writing a dissertation on Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, an intellectual biography, which has been published recently, and I guess it's a sign of what an important topic it is, that it's created quite a stir. I have to say, in my own neck of the woods, which is art history, when you publish a book and anybody notices it, you're really quite excited. But here, you're almost famous at the meeting. Anyway, she is going to talk on the subject of Wahhabism. And I have before she begins, I just have to make a very embarrassing announcement, which is I have to leave because I had a meeting scheduled. So I am going to sit right by the door, but you're to pay absolutely no attention when I make a very quiet exit before the refreshments are served, which will be afterwards. And so Natana will be in charge of taking her own questions at the end, and then you can enjoy and talk with her afterwards. So with great pleasure, I introduce her to you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today for the rescheduled lecture, and hopefully I'll be able to get through it today without going into any coughing fits. In the aftermath of September 11th, Wahhabism has become a topic of major interest to governments, political analysts, the media, and academics alike. The term Wahhabism is rarely defined, but it is understood to represent an extremist, violent, and misogynistic interpretation of Islam that is spread to all corners of the globe and represents a tremendous threat to both American interests and non-Wahhabi Muslims. Wahhabism has been called radical, contemptuous of modernity, and nothing less than Islamofascism following the traditions of communism and Nazism. It's accused of inspiring militant religious extremism in movements ranging from the Taliban of Afghanistan to the so-called Wahhabis of Central Asia and Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda network. It is targeted as the most intolerant of all interpretations of Islam, seeking to impose itself alone as the expression of true Islam. Wahhabi teachings are often referred to as fanatical discourse, and Wahhabism itself is called the most retrograde expression of Islam and one of the most xenophobic, radical Islamic movements that can be. Typical images of Wahhabis include bearded, unkempt men waving Kalashnikovs and Korans in their quest for martyrdom, and silent women shrouded from head to toe in black. Believed to be the inspiration of bin Laden's global jihad, in which the world is absolutely divided into Muslims and non-Muslims, or Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, with no in-between categories, Wahhabism has become synonymous with terrorism and hatred of America, the West, and women. These images, while very popular, are very deceptive. What we see is not always an accurate reflection of reality. When these images are examined in greater detail, according to evidence rather than emotion, we find a far more complex mosaic of realities than we would expect from the stereotypes that we typically see and hear about. Our purpose today is to examine stereotypes of Wahhabi dedication to jihad on the basis of evidence. We'll begin with a brief discussion of the Wahhabi movement as a mainstream 18th century revival and reform movement, prior to turning to the critical question of jihad and its role in the early Wahhabi movement. We'll then examine how Wahhabi interpretations of jihad have changed according to historical context at the turn of the 19th century, followed by comparison of these developments to the unending global jihad declared by Osama bin Laden and its relationship, real or imagined, to Wahhabism proper. Wahhabism was founded in the 18th century as a revival and reform movement by the Hanbali scholar and jurist Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. A native of the province of Najd in contemporary Saudi Arabia, he engaged in studies both at home with his father and in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina prior to traveling to Basra in contemporary Iraq. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's travels and studies brought him into contact with an international network of scholars, teachers, and students. His writings, which include theological treatises, legal commentaries and opinions, a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, hadith collections, and exegetical studies according to theme, rather than the standard classical approach of writing a verse-by-verse commentary, cover business and commercial transactions, criminal, commercial, and family law, catechetical discussions of major theological beliefs, and relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. These writings reflect many of the major themes that were hallmarks of 18th century Islamic scholarship. First, a revival of hadith studies, the hadith being the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, that are focused on content rather than the chain of transmission. Second, a direct individual return to Scripture, the Quran and Sunnah, for the following purposes. First, to determine the broad ethics and values, both by considering the historical context in which the revelations were received and by examining the full teachings of the Quran on a given theme or concept rather than literal interpretation that would be limited to a single verse or taken out of context. Secondly, to assert the authority of Scripture over human interpretations of the same. And third, to reassert and rejuvenate the role of Islamic law in the public sphere. In Ibn Abdul Wahhab's case, this meant reclaiming legal tools like maslaha, or the consideration of public welfare in the interpretation of the law, rather than adhering to literal interpretations of the law removed from social context. The third major 18th century theme apparent in his work is the rejection of taqlid, which is considering past interpretations of Scripture to be authoritative, in favor of ijtihad, or a fresh and direct individual interpretation, in order to recapture the meaning of the Scriptures in their original context. Fourth, the implementation of private religious beliefs into public action. Fifth, the rejection of popular traditions, rituals, customs, and practices that violated Ibn Abdul Wahhab's understanding of Tawheed as monotheism in favor of a pure interpretation of Islam. And sixth, an evolutionary rather than revolutionary approach to revival and reform based on grassroots activism and education rather than overthrowing governments or engaging in jihad as holy war. In addition, and to my knowledge unique for an 18th century scholar, Ibn Abdul Wahhab was a proponent of a balance of rights between men and women. He based this teaching on recognition that the Quran prescribes equal responsibilities toward God for men and women, thus suggesting that the Quran also intended a balance of rights in their human relations. Ibn Abdul Wahhab held both genders responsible for carrying out the 5 pillars of Islam and for studying and interpreting the Quran. He declared a balance of rights in matters of marriage and divorce, guaranteeing the woman the right to have a voice in her marriage by requiring her consent, regardless of her age or status as a virgin or deflowered woman, and her right to divorce by khul, by repaying her dower to the husband upon her recognition that she could no longer fulfill the requirements of marriage. This interpretation assured the woman the practical right to assert khul, unfettered by the husband, in the same way that the husband has the right to divorce by talaq, unfettered by the woman. Ibn Abdul Wahhab also balanced the husband's rights in marriage by granting the woman the right to stipulate conditions favorable to her in the marriage contract, relating both to the contracting and the continuation of the marriage. Ibn Abdul Wahhab became most famous for his dedication to the doctrine of Tawheed, or absolute monotheism, in which God and God alone is considered worthy of prayer and worship. Ibn Abdul Wahhab pointed to Tawheed as the defining, distinguishing, and central tenet of the Islamic faith. The emphasis on Tawheed was an important theme for reformers throughout the 18th century Muslim world, as the great Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires were perceived to have entered a period of decline that was more often than not blamed on the rise of popular Sufism which emphasized practices like worshiping holy persons and tomb and shrine visitations to request that holy person's intercession with God. Ibn Abdul Wahhab is frequently pointed to as one of the most dedicated activists in his insistence on absolute monotheism. Now, it's often assumed that this dedication to Tawheed led Ibn Abdul Wahhab to declare anybody who did not share his perspective or violated his interpretation of Tawheed to be an associationist, a mushrik, or even worse, an unbeliever, a kafir, and to divide the world into two absolute spheres of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. In fact, Ibn Abdul Wahhab limited his use of the terms mushrik and kafir to places where a person had accepted Islam following a period of education in the faith and only afterwards decided to reject Islam. According to his teachings, thus, anyone who had not followed this path could not be appropriately labeled with either title because of the potential that that person might not understand what Tawheed was or meant, or that the person did not understand how or why actions like worshiping saints or visiting tombs or shrines might violate Tawheed. He taught that the appropriate response to dealing with a potentially ignorant person, or even a mushrik or a kafir, was to continue in instruction and discussion about why this person's actions were wrong. This potential for misunderstanding or lack of information led Ibn Abdul Wahhab to compose his most famous treatise, Kitab al-Tawheed, or the Book of Monotheism. Although this treatise has often been misinterpreted as a code for determining who is outside of the faith or as a manifesto for action, Kitab al-Tawheed was actually written as a catechism, explaining to Muslims the practical realities of what adherence to Tawheed meant, so that individual Muslims would know what kinds of behaviors they should engage in and what kinds of behaviors they should avoid. One of the most striking aspects of Kitab al-Tawheed is that it does not declare a person engaged in activities labeled as shirk or associationism automatically subject to jihad as holy war or to the death penalty. The death penalty is limited to a person who's engaged in sorcery. Otherwise, the treatise recommends that people engaged in questionable practices be instructed as to what they ought to be doing instead, be avoided, or be verbally admonished for their activities. So given the common stereotypes of Wahhabis as militantly and violently opposed via jihad to anybody and everybody not abiding by Wahhabi teachings, this raises some serious questions about the role of jihad in the early Wahhabi movement. When and why did Ibn Abdul Wahhab call for jihad? Ibn Abdul Wahhab considered the topic of jihad to be important enough to deserve a treatise outlining its definition, legal uses, and implications. It is significant that Kitab al-Jihad, or the Book of Jihad, is neither a manifesto for action nor a laundry list of cases in which jihad is justified and permissible. Rather, the broad theme of the book is the limitation of jihad to specific cases and conditions. Ibn Abdul Wahhab defined jihad as a defensive activity permissible only in cases where the Muslim community was under attack or under the threat of imminent attack. He did not allow for offensive jihad. The stance was due to his belief that the purpose of jihad was not the aggrandizement of the Muslim community or annihilation of the enemy, but rather was either the gaining of converts or the establishment of a treaty relationship with those who chose not to convert. In other words, the intended outcome of jihad was the establishment of a formal relationship with the former enemy. Had all of the opponents been slaughtered, there wouldn't have been anybody left to convert or engage in a treaty relationship with. Furthermore, because Ibn Abdul Wahhab believed that conversion should be the result of a gradual process of education about Islam through dialogue, debate, and study, he taught that conversion, which required true faith of the heart, should not occur at sword point or under the threat of death. He did not believe that death row conversions could ever be due to true conviction of the heart. How exactly does a person engage in jihad? The activity engaged in jihad is declared by Ibn Abdul Wahhab to be qatala, which is form 3 of the Arabic verb meaning fight, rather than qatala, which is form 1 meaning to kill. It may be assumed that some killing is going to occur during the process of fighting, but killing is not the objective of this jihad. The purpose of fighting is to cause the enemy to either retreat or surrender. It's not to annihilate the enemy. The degree of violence is therefore not as extreme as the Wahhabis are often portrayed to be. Yet it is in keeping with Ibn Abdul Wahhab's teaching that the purpose of jihad is to gain converts or establish a treaty relationship. To underscore this fact, Ibn Abdul Wahhab proclaimed that any Muslim who kills the enemy in battle not only is not entitled to a share of the booty, but is also to be cast out of his rank because he has prevented the enemy from having the opportunity to convert or seek a treaty relationship with Muslims. Ibn Abdul Wahhab specified that jihad is not called for in cases in which the personal practices or habits of a given group of people are considered to be inappropriate or offensive, but do not result in aggressions against Muslims. Examples that he includes in his writings are the consumption of alcohol or the broad desire for power. It's a very significant point given that Wahhabis are typically accused of fighting and killing anybody who doesn't observe Wahhabi practices. In fact, Ibn Abdul Wahhab stated that he deplored such a position and that offensive and preemptive strikes were not appropriate in these cases. He also forbade jihad against people with whom one had a business or treaty relationship because these relationships necessarily precluded jihad. The relationship already existed, so there was no point in engaging in a jihad to establish a relationship. Because the establishment of a formal relationship or conversion was the goal of jihad, Ibn Abdul Wahhab required that the jihad begin with an attempt to call the opponents to Islam. If the opponents could be persuaded to convert or establish a treaty relationship prior to military engagement, so much the better. He required that the opponents be given a fair, not just a nominal, opportunity to convert to Islam before jihad could become appropriate. He believed that this approach was consistent with the legal principle of maslahah, or public interest, because it was clearly in the interest and welfare of the Muslim community to have peaceful relationships with other people. Ibn Abdul Wahhab legitimated jihad only in the self-defense of the Muslim community. Even then, he restricted its use to enemy combatants and equipment used to carry out military aggression. Jihad against civilians was strictly forbidden, as was the destruction of property unrelated to the fight. Thus, while you could attack a fortress where soldiers were hiding, you couldn't burn the fortress down if you knew that civilians, particularly women and children, happened to be inside. Protection of civilians, women, children, slaves, the elderly, the handicapped, and religious scholars, both Muslim and non-Muslim, was to be respected during jihad. Ibn Abdul Wahhab specifically prohibited the killing of monks and rabbis because he recognized them as men of God. He left sovereignty over their lives or deaths in the hands of God, not in the hands of those engaged in jihad. In other words, the blanket killing of civilians, even Jews and Christians, was forbidden. Ibn Abdul Wahhab believed that the establishment of a treaty relationship was always preferable to any other relationship or arrangement, particularly killing, enslavement, or sacrifice. Similarly, the wanton destruction of property and plant and animal life was strictly forbidden because it served no legitimate purpose and reflected an intent to cause harm beyond what was necessary to achieve the goal of jihad, which again was winning converts or establishing a treaty relationship. In other words, the elimination of the enemy, that's the desired outcome, was to occur through conversion or a treaty relationship, not by killing the enemy. It's not to say that Ibn Abdul Wahhab was a utopian or that he had a very impractical view of how warfare is to be conducted. He recognized that the ultimate goals of jihad could not always be achieved and that there would always be cases in which the enemy refused to convert or enter into a treaty relationship. So what about these cases? Ibn Abdul Wahhab left the choice over their future up to those who were captured during the jihad. They had a choice. They could convert, engage in a treaty relationship, be enslaved, or be killed. This teaching is a very important departure from the classical approach of the major law schools, which called for killing both male and female captives at the conclusion of jihad. Ibn Abdul Wahhab forbade killing them, calling instead for them to be locked up so that they couldn't do any further harm to the Muslims, but also to allow the imam the opportunity to call them to the Muslim faith. Men who refused the call to Islam were then to be made available for exchanges of prisoners of war with the enemy. Women and children were not to be ransomed because Ibn Abdul Wahhab believed that they would receive better treatment and protection from the Muslims. Muslims were charged not only with ransoming other Muslims from the enemy, but also ransoming anybody with whom they already had a treaty relationship. Only after this exchange of prisoners had occurred could the remaining captives be given the choices of entering a treaty relationship with the Muslims, becoming slaves, or choosing death. Ibn Abdul Wahhab believed that this sequence was again the best means of fulfilling maslahah, or public interest. By leaving the choice in the hands of the captive rather than the captor, he also sought to limit the amount of violence and killing in jihad. Ibn Abdul Wahhab further broke with the major law schools by declaring that family units had the right to remain intact even in captivity. He declared that neither the marriage nor the parental bond were abrogated by the fact of captivity. Similarly, minor siblings were not to be separated. He also allowed families to continue the religious education of their children according to their own religious beliefs. Ibn Abdul Wahhab forbade the ill treatment of captives, particularly prohibiting the amputation of the hands or feet of captives, which had been a tribal custom. Rape or any other kind of sexual relations with female captives was strictly prohibited, in keeping with his broad protection of women and concern that they not be forced into prostitution, regardless of their religious affiliation. All of these teachings fly in the face of stereotypes of Wahhabis as labeling everybody differing in religious beliefs or practices of being kuffar who had to be exterminated. In fact, not only did Ibn Abdul Wahhab not support such extremism, he actually denounced it, charging his followers that they should never enter into jihad with a spirit of hatred or deception. There is no cult of martyrdom in Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings. In fact, he never mentions martyrdom at all in any of his writings on jihad, again reinforcing his understanding that the purpose of jihad is the self-defense of the Muslim community under attack and the restoration of peaceful, cooperative relations, either by conversion or the establishment of a treaty relationship. Death, suicide, and martyrdom have no role in this understanding of jihad, suggesting that fighting to the death was not one of his requirements of the mujahideen. Rather, his writings on jihad are permeated by a consistent theme of the maximum preservation of human life and property. This again marked a departure from classical interpretations of jihad that called for fighting to the death and which considered treaty relationships to be a last and undesirable resort. Similar to his refusal to engage in name-calling and exclusionism, Ibn Abdul Wahhab also did not divide the world into two absolute categories of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb in order to develop an us versus them kind of mentality. Rather, he encouraged positive and peaceful engagement and dialogue and discussion geared toward reconciliation, cooperation, and that all-important treaty relationship whenever possible, especially with non-Muslims. Fighting was therefore an option only in a case where the enemy refused conversion or that treaty relationship. Ibn Abdul Wahhab defined jihad as a fard kifaya, or a collective duty, rather than a fard ayn, or individual duty. It's required of mature, free Muslim men of good moral character with the financial ability to do so. The Muslim engaging in jihad is supposed to do so with the intent of remembering and serving God. He should be available for duty at least once a year, unless he's making the Hajj pilgrimage or is in a period of truce. That definition makes it clear that Ibn Abdul Wahhab's vision of jihad is not one of unending permanent engagement. It also makes it clear that the motivation behind jihad is to be service of God rather than aggrandizement or glory of individuals. By placing the emphasis on jihad as a collective duty, it's clear that jihad is intended to serve the community. This definition also distinguishes jihad from the traditional Arab raid known as the Ghaz, which had at its purpose acquisition of booty, military glory, and territory, but enjoyed no religious or ideological justification. By contrast, Ibn Abdul Wahhab allowed taking only necessity items during jihad, and if the enemies converted to Islam or entered that treaty relationship at the conclusion, any property that had been taken from them had to be returned. Now, it's typically asserted that Ibn Abdul Wahhab adhered to the teachings of the medieval Hanbali scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who was responsible for introducing the legitimation of Muslims fighting against other Muslims if their behavior or beliefs indicated that they were actually kuffar or unbelievers rather than so-called true Muslims. So in other words, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, a person's assertion or claim to be a Muslim didn't necessarily make them so. Their words and their actions had to be consistent. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote during the twin threats of the Mongol invasions and the Crusades. Politically, what he was looking for was a religious legitimation to overthrow the Mongols who had nominally converted to Islam, but who retained their own customary law rather than Islamic law in governing the state. Ibn Taymiyyah declared that the Mongols' failure to adhere to Islamic law in fact rendered them non-Muslims who were necessarily subject to jihad as offensive holy war. That makes it very significant that, contrary to popular belief and assumptions, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings do not reflect adherence to Ibn Taymiyyah's teachings. In fact, his citations of Ibn Taymiyyah account for less than 2% of all citations in his written works. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's purpose as a preacher and a jurist was not to go around labeling people as believers or unbelievers, but to encourage people to pay more attention to Quranic values and intent in living out their lives as Muslims whose primary duty was to uphold monotheism. In other words, his purpose was not to condemn, but to encourage individuals to take greater responsibility for their actions and beliefs. Whereas Ibn Taymiyyah declared anybody who did not agree with his teachings to be a kafir, Ibn Abdul Wahhab limited the label of kafir to the case of a person who had claimed to be a Muslim, had gone through that educational program, and then afterwards decided that he was going to reject Islam. You had to be a believer first and subsequently reject Islam in order to qualify as a kafir. Ibn Abdul Wahhab did not allow the label of kafir for a person who had not received religious instruction or whose practices differed slightly from those of his followers. Similarly, Ibn Abdul Wahhab did not legitimate the offensive approach to jihad that was declared acceptable by Ibn Taymiyyah. Most importantly, with respect to jihad, Ibn Taymiyyah's writings emphasized the concept of martyrdom, particularly the rewards of the afterlife for the one who dies while engaging in jihad. As previously mentioned, that concept of martyrdom is completely absent from Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings because he believes that the intent in jihad should be service of God rather than gaining some kind of benefit for oneself. Ibn Taymiyyah's notorious themes of rejection of Christianity and Judaism as heretical religions are also absent from Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings. Ibn Abdul Wahhab respected the Quranic concept of the people of the book and included space in his worldview for peaceful coexistence with Christians and Jews, including the freedom to practice and teach their religion. Wahhabism proper was thus not insistent on its own exclusive access to the truth and did not deny the right of other religious groups to exist or practice or teach their faith. The details and broad values of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's approach to jihad laid out here raise some very serious questions about the links between contemporary extremists who are often labeled as Wahhabis, like Osama bin Laden, and Wahhabism as it was originally founded. Contemporary developments like bin Laden's ideology of unending global jihad and a cosmic conflict between good, defined as Islam, and evil, defined as everything else, clearly do not derive their inspiration from Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings. Just as clear is the inspiration, both directly acknowledged and more subtly present, of the works of Ibn Taymiyyah, particularly the legitimation of inter-Muslim warfare by redefining who qualifies as a Muslim and enabling individuals, rather than God, to judge other individuals. So why then are such jihadi movements called Wahhabi, and where do the negative stereotypes of Wahhabism come from? At what point in time do Wahhabism and militant extremism meet? Ironically, the jihadi mentality that today bears Ibn Abdul Wahhab's name developed after his withdrawal from public life. After the death of his initial political protector, Muhammad ibn Saud, in 1765, political leadership passed to Ibn Saud's son, Abdulaziz. It was Abdulaziz who first made selective and literal use of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings and implemented a convert or die approach to state expansion and consolidation and the quest for wealth and property. That is, it was the political necessity of state consolidation that led to the reinterpretation of jihad as a political tool. This approach was so offensive to Ibn Abdul Wahhab that he withdrew from public life to pursue prayer and meditation. He served as an occasional advisor to Abdulaziz, but he did not legitimate his military activities as a jihad. And thus we see the first shift of Wahhabism in action away from the socio-educational focus of its founder to a more militant and political emphasis. Secondly, at the turn of the 19th century, the Wahhabis found themselves on the brink of military conflict with the Ottoman Empire for control over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Because the Quran strictly forbids fighting and killing between Muslims, engagement with the Ottomans represented a legal and theological conundrum to the Wahhabis. How could they justify armed combat against fellow Muslims, particularly when Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself had never allowed for the removal from power of a leader, no matter how bad of a Muslim he was? Ibn Abdul Wahhab had taught that leaving a corrupt ruler in power was a lesser evil than the social chaos and disruption that would occur with his forcible removal from power. In keeping with classical scholarship, he limited the response to the failures of the leader to discussion and debate about his errors. Wahhabi scholars found their solution in Ibn Taymiyyah's claim that any ruler who did not fully implement Islamic law as the law of the land could not be considered a true Muslim. Ibn Taymiyyah not only declared such a ruler to be a kafir or unbeliever who was subject to jihad as holy war, but he also used the label of kafir to refer to anybody who did not abide by his full teachings, thus further justifying a jihad of holy war against kuffar that included offensive as well as defensive military actions. Ibn Taymiyyah's teachings on this topic reveal a literal rather than contextual interpretation of the Quran to support his position. This approach was a major departure from Ibn Abdul Wahhab's own emphasis on contextual interpretation of the Quran. And so we can see that a literalist Wahhabi approach to Quran interpretation can also be traced to this time period. Wahhabi scholars of this time believed that the Ottomans deserved to be correctly labeled as kuffar because they'd failed to act as proper sovereigns over the Hijaz. Not only were pilgrims on their way to the Hajj frequently attacked, but corruption, greed, violence, and insecurity were rampant throughout the Hijaz. Most importantly, the Ottomans did not fully and unconditionally implement Islamic law as the law of the land. Because of the political need for justification of armed conflict against the Ottomans, Ibn Taymiyyah's writings were adopted into mainstream Wahhabi teachings, even though these teachings had not been adopted by Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself. Thus, that 19th century Wahhabi adoption of Ibn Taymiyyah's teachings represented a departure from, rather than continuity with, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's teachings. It's possible that the adoption of Ibn Taymiyyah's more extremist vision of who qualified as Muslims and justifications for violence and killing and offensive jihad resulted in the third and historically the most notorious incident for which the Wahhabis have become known, their armed conflict with the Shi'i populations of Najaf and Karbala, again at the turn of the 19th century. This conflict had two different dimensions. One was the destruction of important Shi'i shrines in those regions, and the second was the massacre of the Shi'i populations of those areas. Both dimensions became part of the historical memory and portrayal of Wahhabism, suggesting that Wahhabis have been particularly violent against Shi'is because they don't consider Shi'is to be true Muslims. Again, this 19th century interpretation is at odds with Ibn Abdul Wahhab's own teachings. Now, Ibn Abdul Wahhab had very strong theological concerns about certain practices associated with Shi'ism during his lifetime, most notably the visitation of shrines and the special status that was accorded to the Shi'i imams. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's dedication to Tawheed as absolute monotheism resulted in his call to follow the Prophet Muhammad's own example of destroying shrines and tombs in order to prevent people from worshiping human beings there. His own example included the destruction of the tomb of one of the Prophet's companions, an act that's considered one of the three hallmarks of Wahhabism. The other two are the chopping down of a sacred tree for similar reasons, and the third was the stoning of an adulteress. Thus, the destruction of the shrines in Karbala and Najaf were in keeping with Ibn Abdul Wahhab's own example and also with the Prophet Muhammad's example. The massacre of the Shi'i populations was an entirely different matter, and one that I believe Ibn Abdul Wahhab would not have approved of. It's important to recall that these massacres occurred 10 years after Ibn Abdul Wahhab died and more than 40 years after he withdrew from public life. Consistent with his teachings about the appropriate means of interacting with people, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who had beliefs or practices that differed from those of the Wahhabis, Ibn Abdul Wahhab wrote in the only treatise he ever dedicated to the topic of Shi'is that the appropriate means of addressing Shi'is was by discussing the Quran, Sunnah, and Shi'i legal and theological texts with them. He did not call for fighting them in a jihad or for violence as the correct venue for winning converts, even in a case where the group in question claimed to have the exclusive truth. He categorically rejected any claims to the exclusive truth because he believed exclusive truth belonged only to the Quran and Sunnah, not to human interpretations. He counseled his followers to be suspicious of anybody who claimed to have the exclusive truth, suggesting that historical portrayals of Wahhabis as claiming to have that exclusive truth are in fact inaccurate. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's treatise that addresses the Shi'is covers 32 theological points of difference between his understanding of Islam and Shi'i legal and theological points. Most important topics were the status of the caliphate, Shi'i accusations of apostasy against Muhammad's companions because they had refused to recognize the imamate, personal status issues related to marriage and divorce, particularly the practice of muta or temporary marriage, and comparison of the Shi'is to other religious groups considered to be non-Muslim, yet with whom a special treaty relationship was possible, namely Christians, Jews, and Magi's. Fully a quarter of the topics addressed matters pertaining to women. The methodology for addressing Shi'i issues was to deal with them on the basis of what Shi'i scholars and jurists had written, rather than on the basis of hearsay or propaganda. So he was clearly very familiar with the Shi'i worldview and theology. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's main point of contention with the Shi'is was over the nature of authority, both scriptural and religio-political. Sunnis consider the Quran and Sunnah to be the only authoritative sources of scripture. Shi'is add in the teachings of the Imams, either 5, 7, or 12, depending on which branch of Shi'ism we're talking about. To Ibn Abdul Wahhab, that assertion of human infallibility for somebody other than Muhammad was a departure from monotheism. Similarly, he pointed to the case of Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha, who'd been accused of adultery while married to Muhammad, yet was vindicated and declared innocent by 17 different Quran verses, as fundamentally an issue of the authority of Scripture versus human interpretations. For Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the revelation of Quran verses supporting Aisha's innocence closed the topic to debate. God himself had spoken, he declared her innocent, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. However, Shi'is continued to vilify Aisha as an adulteress, suggesting that they took a selective approach to the Quran and its authority. For Shi'is, the issue wasn't simply about whether or not Aisha had committed adultery, but also because she had resisted Ali's leadership as the Imam and fourth Caliph, and because she had led an armed rebellion against Ali's forces in the Battle of the Camel that Ali had ultimately won. Scriptural authority was also an issue with respect to the Hadith, because Aisha and Ali frequently offered conflicting information about Muhammad's declarations. Thus, the matter of Aisha's innocence was not simply one of a virtuous woman being accused of adultery, but more importantly marked major theological battle lines over the authority of Scripture. Difference of opinion over scriptural authority led Ibn Abdul Wahhab to label assertions of Aisha's adultery as kufr, unbelief, and irtidad, or apostasy, one of the rare cases where he made use of these very strong theological terms. Even in this case, though, he did not prescribe killing or jihad as holy war as the appropriate solution. Consistent with all of his other writings, he continued to call for dialogue, debate, and discussion as the appropriate means of eventually convincing the Shi'is of their theological errors. Historical events of the early 19th century, armed conflict with the Ottoman Empire and the Shi'i populations of Karbala and Najaf, clearly reflected a more exclusivist approach to the interpretation of Islam, suggesting that the connection between Wahhabism, Ibn Taymiyyah, and extremism lies in early 19th century interpretations of Wahhabism rather than in the ideology of Wahhabism's founder. The confusion between Wahhabism proper and Wahhabism as it developed historically also helps to explain why the label Wahhabi is assigned to disparate militant movements in the contemporary era, including a variety of civil wars and armed insurrections ranging from Algeria and Afghanistan to Chechnya and Uzbekistan, as well as, most infamously, to Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network. Upon careful examination, it becomes clear that what these movements share is either a dedication to carrying out a struggle for independence in the name of jihad, or the assertion of a ruling government that they are doing so. These jihads are not about converting people or establishing treaty relationships. They're about overthrowing un-Islamic and often corrupt, unjust, and repressive governments that have proven incapable of dealing with the dire socioeconomic and political problems these societies face in favor of an Islamic state. These themes are not rooted in Ibn Abdul Wahhab's vision of tawhid or monotheism, but in the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah justifying the overthrow of an unjust ruler and the call for unending global jihad as the ongoing permanent duty of all Muslims that is derived from the teachings of the 20th century Egyptian radical Sayyid Qutb. So now that we've clarified the historical record, what relationship, if any, exists between Osama bin Laden and Wahhabism proper? Although he's most notorious today for his declaration of unending global jihad against American crusaders and Zionists, Osama bin Laden was originally a Saudi dissident who called repeatedly upon Saudi King Fahd to resign from his position due to allegations of corruption and incompetence. One of the great ironies of bin Laden's position as a dissident was that he had previously enjoyed a certain degree of royal favor, specifically while he was engaged in the Afghan Jihad against the Soviet Union. However, by 1992, bin Laden had changed his position from one of supporting the monarchy to one of protesting it. The critical issue was the king's decision to call for American troops to protect Saudi Arabia following Saddam Hussein's invasion of neighboring Kuwait. Bin Laden believed that the invasion presented an opportunity for seasoned Saudi fighters who had returned from Afghanistan to participate in the defense of their own country. He particularly highlighted the importance of having Muslim soldiers protect the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Not surprisingly, King Fahd's preference for infidel American troops over Saudi soldiers resulted in anger, disillusionment, and ultimately revolt on bin Laden's part. Bin Laden's initial response was nonviolent in nature. He formed the ARC, or Advice and Reform Committee, in 1992 to protest nonviolently the king's decision to call in American troops and to call for domestic change and reform, particularly in education and the legal and political systems. He demanded that the schools focus on the Quran, Sunnah, and teachings of our predecessors, whom he specified as Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who was Ibn Taymiyyah's most famous student, and Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Just for the record, bin Laden never cites Ibn Abdul Wahhab in any of his writings, whereas Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim feature very prominently. The work of the ARC in the early period reflected the methodology of Wahhabism proper: direct return to scripture, calling on the government to adhere more closely to the teachings of Islam, pressuring for reforms to the legal system to make it more in keeping with the Sharia, an emphasis on education and socio-moral reform. However, by 1995, a shift back to early 19th century Wahhabism occurred as criticism of the king became more targeted to demonstrate why he was not a good Muslim. Charges against the king included fiscal mismanagement, corruption, and co-optation of the religious establishment to rubber stamp the monarchy's policies. In bin Laden's opinion, these failures rendered the king a non-Muslim ruler who was therefore subject to jihad as holy war, an argument reminiscent of that used to justify armed combat against the Ottomans in the early 19th century. Bin Laden's proposed solution, not a very practical one, was for the king to resign. Not surprisingly, the king failed to take this advice, so bin Laden called for armed conflict to force the monarchy to dismiss American troops. Many have asserted that the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers, where American troops were stationed, bore bin Laden's signature, although the Saudi government still continues to insist that the perpetrators of this act are not known. By 1997, bin Laden was openly calling for the overthrow of the entire Saudi royal family. In addition to his domestic activities between 1995 and 1997, bin Laden expanded his vision to the international arena. He issued his joint fatwa with a variety of religious and legal scholars because bin Laden himself is not recognized as a religious or legal scholar. He doesn't have the credentials to issue this kind of statement on his own. Calling for unending global jihad against American crusaders and Zionists. In order to gain a broader following than he had enjoyed within the confines of the kingdom, he specifically took on three issues of global concern to Muslims: the American responsibility for the devastation of Iraq as measured in the human toll of ongoing economic sanctions, unconditional American support for Israel as evidenced by repeated failures to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict and American refusal to condemn Israeli actions against the Palestinians, and the ongoing presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia. The adoption of these three rallying causes turned bin Laden from a Saudi dissident into an international hero for many, not because of his call to global jihad, but because he had targeted issues of international concern to Muslims and was actively doing something about them as opposed to just sitting around and talking about them. While the overwhelming majority of Muslims globally remain very uncomfortable with bin Laden's tactics, particularly terrorist attacks against civilians, just as many are sympathetic to the causes he has identified and share his frustration with the international community's failure to resolve them. How does bin Laden's vision of jihad compare to Wahhabism proper? His worldview differs markedly. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's teachings were grounded in the central doctrine of Tawheed and formed the religious justification for the existence of the Saudi monarchy. Bin Laden preaches jihad and has called for the overthrow of the monarchy. Bin Laden understands global jihad to be a cosmic conflict between good, or Islam, and evil, everything else, that recognizes neither compromise nor end and is to be engaged by every Muslim as an individual duty. By contrast, Ibn Abdul Wahhab taught that the purpose of jihad was to end hostility and to formalize a peaceful relationship between localized fighting parties, upholding jihad as a collective duty. Whereas Ibn Abdul Wahhab forbade the killing of civilians, particularly monks and rabbis, and rampant destruction of property is contrary to the purpose of jihad, Bin Laden has called for indiscriminate killing, particularly of Jews and Christians, but also of Muslims, and property damage is critical to the success of jihad. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's worldview called for Islam as the basis for public order, welfare, and reform, served as a blueprint for the socio-moral reconstruction of society. Bin Laden's current worldview defines relations between Muslims and the rest of the world as a matter of jihad, offering a vision of the future based on destruction, fear, and discord. It contains elements of both early 19th century Wahhabism and the 20th century global jihadism of Sayyid Qutb. Given these differences, we have one last question to ask, and that is, to what degree is bin Laden representative of Wahhabism as it is interpreted in Saudi Arabia today? Does his personal trajectory from Wahhabism proper to early 19th century interpretations of Wahhabism and contemporary global jihad represent the trajectory of Wahhabism in general? In other words, are contemporary Wahhabism and radical jihadist extremism one and the same? Now, it's typically assumed that there's only one interpretation of Wahhabism in the kingdom. The reality is actually a diversity of interpretations, in large part because there are a wide variety of religious bodies and interpreters who are active in the kingdom, including but not limited to religious scholars who teach formally in the universities and madrasas or religious schools, in disciplines ranging from law to economics. We have informal religious scholars who are trained and teach outside of formal government circles, some of whom are political dissidents. There are the Mutawa, or the Committee for the Prevention of Vice and Promotion of Virtue, who are responsible for enforcing public morality. There are judges and lawyers who interpret Islamic law in the official court system, including criminal, commercial, and family law. There are imams presiding over a variety of mosques, both official and unofficial. There's the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, Endowment, Call, and Guidance, which is responsible for overseeing the image of Islam in the kingdom and abroad, engaging in and supervising missionary work, call centers and offices, running and supporting a variety of religious and educational institutions, answering legal queries, maintaining good relations with prospective converts, and writing and distributing religious literature. Finally, both women and the National Center for Dialogue have inserted their voices into the interpretation of Islam in the kingdom. In short, there are many individuals and institutions who interpret Islam in Saudi Arabia today. And the result is that Wahhabism is not a monolithic interpretation of Islam, but is subject to the same variety of opinions, discussion, and debate that occur anywhere that people from a variety of backgrounds, specializations, interests, and occupations are engaged in the interpretation of a living religion. Although certain individuals and organizations enjoy greater prominence and government support than others, there are differences of opinion even within the government. There are also indications of a shift in interpretational methodology and content over the past 10 years. One of the most important changes has been a shift from the past tendency of emphasizing individual authority, most notably that of the former Grand Mufti Sheikh Abdulaziz bin Baz, and member of the Council of Senior Ulama Sheikh Mohammed Salah al-Uthaymin, to a new tendency that emphasizes the deliberation and majority consensus of the Permanent Committee of Iftah. They require that at least 3 scholars study any issue and that committee scholars agree by an absolute majority on a ruling before it's issued in the committee's name. So we've shifted from individual authority to group authority. The shift demonstrates changes not only in terms of who is issuing legal rulings, but also in the methodology of those rulings and the kinds of questions that are being addressed today. Several other trends indicate a return to the methodology of Wahhabism proper in the kingdom. One is the abandonment of the older function of the ulama, which was popularly perceived as being one of simply rubber stamping the monarchy's policies, in favor of refreshing the role of the ulama to guide state policies and critique the state. A second is a shift away from studies of Islam and Islamic law that are focused on ritual matters like what position you have to stand in or bow in during prayer, and whether you can move your index finger in a particular way at a particular moment in a particular prayer, these kinds of ritual matters, and assertions that faith and prayer can solve any kinds of social problems. Today, issues of social concern like women's rights, marriage, divorce, domestic violence, the implications of drug addiction are being addressed in realistic, practical, and socially meaningful ways, taking into consideration a variety of potential circumstances that would require different responses. In other words, today's rulings are much more context-specific than they are literal or a one-size-fits-all kind of legal ruling. Third, there's been much greater attention to the application of maslahah, or public welfare, in the interpretation of Islamic law as opposed to literal adherence to the law. The variety of topics addressed and this attention to social reality in daily life make it abundantly clear that jihad is not the only topic addressed by religious scholars and institutions in the kingdom, as opposed to bin Laden, who appears only to discuss jihad. How are Saudi interpreters talking about jihad, and in what situations? Although bin Laden has used jihad as the mechanism for justifying and carrying out acts of terrorism, religious scholars and legal interpreters in Saudi Arabia have tended to address terrorism, which they define as a combination of extremism, violence, and fanaticism, and jihad as two separate categories, suggesting that they're two completely different issues that require two completely different responses. In the case of terrorism, both the older generation and more recent scholars have expressed condemnation, although they've used different methodologies to do so. The older generation of scholars made it clear that extremism, violence, and fanaticism were to be condemned because such views are neither substantiated nor supported by the Quran or Sunnah. Former Grand Mufti bin Baz denounced terrorists for spreading corruption, mischief, instability, and security by killing people on false premises, asserting that the need to maintain public order was a high priority. He charged Muslims to stop wrong acts, report them to the authorities, or at the very least disapprove of them. But he did not allow individuals to engage in force, that is, vigilantism, because he believed that the use of force was the prerogative of the state. This position, which is consistent with Wahhabism proper, stands in marked contrast to bin Laden's call for the violent overthrow of an un-Islamic government, which again has ties to early 19th century interpretations and Sayyid Qutb's interpretations. Similarly, Sheikh Mohammed Salih al-Uthaymeen denounced terrorism as inconsistent with the Quran, Sunnah, and Sharia. Referring specifically to the 1995 bombings in Riyadh and the 1996 attacks on the Khobar Tower, he declared that the perpetrators had not only demonstrated a complete lack of knowledge of Scripture, but had also disobeyed and fought against the ruler, all of which rendered them unacceptable to any sensible person, let alone the believers. He denounced the terrorists for damaging the local and international image of Islam by implying a connection between Islam and terrorism. In other words, the terrorists were attacking Islam instead of defending it, which is supposed to be the point of jihad. Finally, al-Uthaymeen expressed concern about the terrorists' lack of respect for the security covenant the kingdom had established with non-Muslims who had come to the kingdom to work in a variety of capacities, including the military, because the king had promised security to these workers. Al-Uthaymeen held Saudis responsible for respecting that security pledge as a matter of obedience to the Quran and Sunnah. He declared that those who violated that security were criminals bent on destroying the country and terrifying innocent people. Like bin Baz, these statements are in keeping with Wahhabism proper and support for social order, standing in marked contrast to bin Laden's calls for overthrowing the government and fighting against anybody whose opinion differs from your own. Al-Uthaymeen's statements have been republished several times in the kingdom since the spate of terrorist attacks and kidnappings of Westerners and hostage takings that began in 2003. The statements of this older generation make it very clear that they are opposed to bin Laden's tactics. The newer generation, reflected in the Permanent Committee of Iftah, has also condemned bin Laden's worldview. The committee released a fatwa following the 2004 terrorist attacks and kidnappings, condemning any action that disrupts the security of the country, sheds innocent blood, terrorizes peaceful people, or destroys property. They also addressed the problematic question of who qualifies as a Muslim because of the perceived impact of bin Laden's bipolar division of the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Kufr, in which there's no in-between category, and anybody who's in Dar al-Kufr is subject to jihad as holy war. The committee responded by discouraging people from judging others, particularly on the basis of ritual adherence. While they recognized the importance of abiding by Islamic teachings, they noted that true devotion to God is not necessarily evidenced by prayers, fasting, or the performance of ritual duties, but by doing things for God's sake and by being content with what God provides. Having defined a Muslim as one who publicly declares adherence to Islam and who submits to God in all circumstances and matters, the committee declared that true submission to God can only be known for certain by God. Therefore, they required people to consider anybody declaring him or herself to be a Muslim to be one, because no human being is capable of knowing or judging the intentions of another. The refusal to judge or allow others to judge the Muslim status of another person marked a departure from past emphasis on ritual perfection, thus distinguishing the committee from the older generation of scholars. However, the purpose of the ruling was similar to that of Bin Baz and Al-Uthaymin, denying the grounds on which terrorism is supposedly legitimated. By denying Muslims the right to declare war on other Muslims on the basis of their own judgment about their status, the committee made a clear break with early 19th century Wahhabism and the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, reasserting instead consistency with Wahhabism proper. In a similar approach, the King Abdulaziz Center for National Dialogue has called on Saudis to combat extremism and fanaticism through dialogue, debate, and discussion. Again, the methods of Wahhabism proper. The main distinguishing feature of the center has been movement beyond rhetoric that condemns terrorism to the development of a comprehensive national plan for combating it. Religion and religious scholars still play an important role, such as in clarifying terms like terrorism, Muslim community, Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Kufr, and presenting interpretations of Islam that are appropriate to contemporary circumstances, limiting the right to issue fatwa to trained and competent scholars. But other components have also been added to develop a broader understanding of extremism and its causes in order to create a comprehensive and effective treatment strategy. Religion plays a role within that strategy, but the strategy also includes acceleration of political reform and public participation in politics and civil society, conducting a national survey on the causes of extremism that would examine a variety of social, political, and economic, as well as religious factors, reform of the educational system to encourage critical thinking, tolerance, moderation, and dialogue, assuring fair and just treatment, including the right to meet with a lawyer for those accused of committing violent or terrorist acts, working to reintegrate back into society those who willingly give up violence, creating a more open and balanced media, and developing educational and employment opportunities for youth designed to keep them away from extremism. Similarly, the Supreme Council of Mosques of the Muslim World League has made sweeping condemnations of violence and terrorism and has called for religious organizations and institutions to take the lead in fighting terrorism on its most important grounds, its ideology. Viewing the existence of religious extremism as an internal problem, the Council has reasserted the role of Muslim scholars as the vanguard in combating corruption and religious extremism by providing more comprehensive instruction both to Saudis and to orators and imams caring for Muslim minorities abroad. The Council has also asserted a need for greater control over the issuing of fatwa, particularly where this topic of jihad is concerned. Similar to the position of Al-Uthaymin, the Council has unequivocally condemned terrorist acts as contrary to Islam's forbidding of injustice, murder, and aggression, particularly the killing of non-Muslims who've been given a covenant of security. The Council's condemnation of the killing of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, as well as terrorism as an act of criminality, leaves no room for terrorists within the Muslim community. It's clear that both past and present scholars and organizations have categorically condemned terrorism and the fanaticism, extremism, and violence that accompany it. Although the justifications differ somewhat, the content reflects Wahhabism proper. What about jihad? It's important to recall that jihad is considered a separate category from terrorism for Saudi interpreters. While terrorism is the killing of innocent civilians and destruction of property for the purpose of generating public fear is rejected and condemned, jihad is more complicated. Saudi interpreters have defined jihad as the act of legitimate self-defense in the face of military aggression, a stance that's supported not only by the Quran and Sunnah, but also by classical interpretations of jihad and Wahhabism proper. Although not sympathetic to terrorism, many Saudi interpreters are sympathetic to the call for jihad in two cases cited by bin Laden, the Arab-Israeli conflict and the occupation of Iraq by American forces. Because these issues are publicly perceived as injustices committed against fellow Arabs and Muslims, where civilians have been attacked, killed, and driven by their homes by invading forces, both are cases where the Quran, Sunnah, classical interpretations of the law, and Wahhabism, both proper and early 19th century, clearly support jihad as an appropriate response. It is with respect to these issues that the Saudi political and religious establishments are caught in a bind. On the one hand, they have to denounce terrorism and extremism. On the other hand, their understanding of their faith requires them to support the Palestinians and Iraqis in their struggles for independence and self-determination. This conflict between denouncing terrorism and supporting jihad as the legitimate defense of the Muslim community under attack is highlighted in a variety of speeches and official statements by Minister of Islamic Affairs, Endowments, Call and Guidance, Sheikh Salah bin Abdulaziz al-Sheikh, who happens to be a descendant of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Sheikh Salah represents a combination of various types of Wahhabism. He's reasserted the right and responsibility of religious scholars to critique the political leadership, and he has called for greater adherence to the Quran, Sunnah, and Sharia as the solution to all of Saudi Arabia's problems, representing a combination of Wahhabism proper and the more literal interpretation of Islam of the older generation, although he does not necessarily support a ritually oriented approach to religion. He also reflects contemporary trends of reasserting Wahhabism proper by rejecting literal interpretations of Scripture, supporting ijtihad by qualified scholars, and calling for the use of maslahah in the interpretation of Islamic law. Like other interpreters, Salah has denounced terrorism and has called for an expanded role for scholars in combating terrorism and extremism and promoting moderation. He defines moderation as complying with Islamic law and rejecting personal tendencies and decisions in favor of resting firmly on knowledge of the Quran, Sunnah, statements of the companions, and other consummate scholars, namely Ahmed ibn Hanbal, al-Shafi, Malik ibn Anas, Abu Hanifa, who were the four founders of the major Sunni law schools, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah. You notice there's somebody missing from that, his ancestor, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. According to this interpretation, fanaticism and extremism are matters of incorrect interpretations of sacred texts, rather than issues of militancy or violence. Salah's insistence on a religious solution to what he continues to view as a religious problem reflects not only his vision that Islam is the solution to Saudi Arabia's problems, but also serves to solidify the power he believes the religious leadership should wield within the kingdom. He therefore calls for providing more power to religious leaders and disseminating more Islamic literature and research to refute any perverted ideology. This interpretation also opens the door to supporting violence and militancy in certain cases, such as Palestine and Iraq, as matters of jihad that are completely separate from terrorism and extremism. Salah consistently distinguishes between terrorism as the illegitimate use of violence to kill undeserving parties and spread corruption and tribulation throughout a nation, and jihad as legitimate resistance to occupation. Similar to the Permanent Committee of Iftah, Salah has refused to judge others or consider them to be non-Muslims on the basis of their actions. He differs from the committee on one significant point. His purpose is to refuse to declare terrorists to be outside of the Muslim community, rather than to address Muslims whose practices or beliefs appear to differ from one's own. The stance is apparent in his refusal to pass judgment on the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, outside of noting that their behavior was abominable, because he believes that more study and discussion of the motivation for the attacks is required before these events can be properly understood. Having noted that there's a difference between interpretations and justifications, he noted that nobody could justify aggression against anybody without having the right to do so, and that injustice and aggression may be the main factors behind people forming terror cells and committing acts of terrorism. Although he then stated that such acts cannot be justified, he specified only those explosions that occurred in Saudi Arabia as contradicting the fundamentals of the Sharia set down by the Quran and Sunnah. This denunciation is then accompanied by a return to his discussion of what he considers to be tolerance. So I would point to Sheikh Salah as being somebody who's engaged in a fair amount of double talk. It's not clear, although he seems to condemn terrorism, there seems to be some support for it if it can be justified as jihad. Other cases demonstrating the tension between denouncing terrorism while supporting jihad include a January 2004 statement passed by the Executive Council of the Ministers of Endowments and Islamic Affairs Conference. Officials responded by equating the aggressions against the Palestinians and Iraqis as instances of state-sponsored terrorism that have not been fought with the same will according to the American-led war on terrorism. The Council statement demands that the international community and those seeking peace support UN resolutions aimed at establishing a just and comprehensive peace in the region, returning the right of self-determination to the Palestinians, establishing an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, and ending the occupation of Iraq, thus ending the justification for jihad. Until this occurs, the Council has declared that resisting the occupation is a legitimate right, although it hasn't specified how that resistance is to be carried out. And there are statements by other organizations and officials that promote the same kinds of ideas. The purpose of the kinds of statements that I'm talking about with respect to Palestine and Iraq is to draw attention to the perception that Palestinians have suffered humiliation, negligence, and injustice, all of which makes terrorism possible. These interpreters all recognize the ability of terrorists to play on political problems, socioeconomic frustrations, and psychological estrangements, and to exploit human suffering through the interpretation of religion in order to achieve political power and win financial support. Within this framework, it's clear to these interpreters that the path to peace and security lies in the resolution of the problems in Iraq and Palestine. Discussions of terrorism, extremism, and jihad presented here make it clear that an environment is being created within the kingdom in which jihadi ideology is increasingly viewed as abhorrent, particularly when combined with terrorist attacks within the kingdom that have horrified the general public and awakened them to the need to combat this ideology on religious grounds as well as militarily. In the past, religious scholars came under fire for giving too much attention to ritual details and for not engaging issues of contemporary concern. Today, much greater attention is being given to social issues and the shaping of public thought, particularly with respect to denouncing terrorism and distinguishing between terrorism and the legitimate interpretation of jihad described in the Quran, Sunnah, and classical interpretations of Islamic law. Debates about terrorism and jihad frequently demonstrate continuity with Wahhabism proper, yet also highlight the degree to which the interpreters of Islam in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia today are engaged in a struggle for the soul of Islam. Thank you. Let's see, yes. If you'd like to.
Just in that way, it'll give you a moment not to have to say anything.
Speak, if you wouldn't mind.
Maybe I'll just de facto invite questions and thank our speaker very much for her remarks. And I throw the floor open to any and all who wish to continue the conversation.
Yes.
There's a count, I think, mentioned by anti-terrorism analyst, I think it's count 98, that funnels money to Palestinian suicide bombers' families in Saudi Arabia. I think it's Is that still running? Has the United States put pressure on Saudi Arabia to cut those accounts, or are those still going?
My understanding is that Saudi Arabia has passed legislation well over a year ago that's blocking any kind of charitable donation abroad altogether. And what's happened is that a national fund is being formed where people can make their charitable donations so that more control is being exercised over what kind of money is going where and in response to what sorts of activities. But in the past, that certainly has been a question.
Al Jazeera came out with a news story, I want to say a month or two ago, that 25 scholars supported the insurgents in Fallujah. Was that the scholars you were talking about? If not, who were they, and what is that Wahhabism proper, or?
I haven't seen a full list of the 25 scholars. Bin Baz and Al-Uthaymin are both deceased, so they would not have been on that. What's interesting in that group of 25 scholars is that two of them were originally cited by bin Laden as being very good scholars and supportive of the kinds of reforms that he was calling for, and had been accused of therefore supporting violence and terrorism and this sort of thing, and are proclaimed to have been rehabilitated by the Saudi government. This would be Safar al-Hawali and Salman al-Auda. And yet these two are signatories to this fatwa legitimating the insurgency in Iraq because it is viewed as a foreign occupation and takeover, overthrow. Granted, Saddam Hussein's government was not particularly appreciated in Saudi Arabia either, but the main concern is that Islam is being denied a public role in this new state that's being developed in Iraq. There was pressure from a number of parties to have Islamic law be implemented in this new state in Iraq, and my understanding is that the American-led coalition has insisted that Islam be left out of the public sphere. They want a secular government established there.
If I may, your very comprehensive and provocative and insightful outline of the history of the Wahhabiyya and its implications lays stress, if I may just summarize it, and correct me if I'm mistaken in any respect, lays stress on the original formulations of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century, the introduction of a much stronger influence of Ibn Taymiyyah and his followers in the early 19th century, and then a question of revision and toing and froing for various reasons in the late 20th and 21st century. I guess the first part of my question would be, in terms of the revision and revisiting of the traditions which in the totality constitute today's Wahhabiyya, proper, improper, modified, and so forth. How much effort is made to use the analysis that you have proposed, which is to distinguish between Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's teaching himself and the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah and other Hanbali scholars? Is this part of the debate, or is your description, in fact, not part of the discussion?
One of the most interesting things about the completion of my book was that it was widely distributed in Saudi Arabia before it was published. I had forwarded a copy of the manuscript to the Institute that had provided access to the archival materials on which I based the analysis. And there's been a great deal of interest in Saudi Arabia in looking, trying to recover more of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's own methodology and analysis, because it seemed to be more progressive, if you will, than some of the current and more literalistic types of interpretations. So the book has generated quite a bit of discussion in Saudi Arabia itself. It's circulating, I guess, in the Crown Prince's circles these days. And it's provided a lot of material for the reform movement to work with in moving away from this attention to ritual adherence into dealing with more socially appropriate interpretations of the law, and also discussions of how Muslims can peacefully coexist with members of other faith groups, that it does not have to always be about conflict and fighting. There was a book published by the Ministry of Islamic Affairs about 6 months ago that, to my knowledge, is the first coming out of Saudi Arabia that actually outlines points in common that Muslims share not only with Christians but also with Jews, and recognizing the validity of those scriptures. It's a big step for the Saudis.
Now, how much of this material that you looked at, you referred to archival collections and manuscripts, how much of this material of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab has actually been published and available? And what, if you the works that you were citing?
The works that I was citing were published in Saudi Arabia back in 1983. It's about 14 volumes worth of material. Some of it is a compilation of marginal notes that he had written in the corners of manuscripts, so they weren't really treatises per se. What I tried to focus on were his theological treatises and his legal writings, both fatwa and fiqh, trying to get a handle on his methodology as well as on his content. My understanding is that that's the first time that anybody has tried to do that and make it available in a Western language.
But the works on Jihad and the other works have been available for about
for
20
20 years, right,
but only 20 years.
but only 20 years. And we're currently working on a program with the King Abdulaziz Foundation for Research and Archives to publish more of the archival materials that they have on file there, including some of the Ottoman archives. Yes?
Was the reason behind these materials only being available for the past 20 years? Was there something glaring? Was there something trying to hide, or was it just?
I think there was just generally a lack of interest. Up until September 11th, there wasn't a great deal of interest in Saudi Arabia or Wahhabism. It was always viewed through the lens of a stereotype, very negative, fanatical, violent, etc., and people felt it really wasn't worthy of study. And now, of course, after September 11th, there are all these questions about, well, good grief, where does this come from? What on earth were these people doing, and what was the religious justification? And is this really how Islam's being practiced in Saudi Arabia today? Yes?
How have the educational reforms been doing? I know a lot of people, a lot of critics of like cite certain hadiths used in school, like ninth graders that incite or encourage rather, killing of Jews, and that there's one that they cite frequently, something about the garden tree or something like that. How have those reforms been going? Are they making?
They are making progress. They're working to get rid of those textbooks and to delete those sorts of passages out of them because they realize how those are being used to justify this kind of violence and aggression against other people, and that's not something that the government or the religious establishment necessarily supports. The problem is, if you take all of the textbooks and throw them out, then you have nothing left to teach with. And so there have been a lot of reports this fall of schools not having enough textbooks to go around because they're going through this process of revising and reprinting them all. But it is underway. I have talked with a member of the Saudi Majlis, which is their consultative council, about their desire to introduce critical thinking into the curriculum, because they're recognizing that if people are not given the ability to think critically about this kind of religious extremism, they don't have the basis for questioning whether or not this is a faithful interpretation of Islam. There's been resistance in the past to introducing critical thinking because you're not going to be able to limit it to the religious sphere. You start critical thinking in one sphere and it's going to spread to other areas. That's simply a reality on the ground. Now you have Al Jazeera broadcasting all sorts of things and allowing for kinds of open debates and discussions that simply weren't possible before. So the momentum is very strong. You can't put the brakes on it anymore. And interestingly, the Saudis are still very interested in working with American educators about learning. It's great to say, okay, we're going to implement critical thinking, but how do you do it? There's a whole mechanical process that goes behind that, and so they're working with American educators to try to revise the system to teach these students how to do this. God bless you. Yes?
I was wondering if sociologically speaking, what percentage would you say are non-Wahhabis? I mean, can we even think of
Can we
Saudi
even-
Arabia in those terms?
It's very difficult.
The shadow is so wide and
Wahhabism remains the official religion of state, and as I've tried to show, there are different ways of interpreting that. You've also got a large Shia population, and then you've got, I believe the latest figures were 22 million foreigners running around. I mean, obviously you don't have synagogues and churches in Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, within some of the compounds, people are able to privately engage in their worship practices. Will there be more opening of that in the future? I suspect that there will be, but it's going to come very, very gradually, as all reforms do in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis had a very negative experience back in 1979 with a man who overtook the Grand Mosque and declared himself to be the Mahdi, and really created quite a crisis for the Saudi monarchy. They don't want a repeat of that. And so this time what they're trying to do is to implement changes and reforms much more gradually, beginning at the community grassroots level and then working up gradually. That's why with elections, for example, they're starting at the municipal level, give that a few years to work so that people can not only learn what it means to serve in public office, but that the public can also learn what it means to be reasonable about your expectations of your elected officials. You can't elect somebody one day and 2 days later expect to have all the sewers be operational in Riyadh. That's simply not a realistic expectation. So the idea is that you engage in a gradual process of reform in order to maintain a certain level of social stability. But the change is definitely coming. Yes?
A book came out not too long ago, Hatred's Kingdom, and it links Saudi Arabia to the spread of global terrorism. I'm wondering how you think a reevaluation of Wahhabism would play into that, or how your own work could be directly used by the Saudi family.
Hatred's Kingdom is focused largely on matters of financing for terrorism, which is not a topic that I've really chosen to address. I'm looking more at religious ideology. So the two books really are not comparable in that respect. Gold's main argument is that the Saudis have always been supportive of extremism and violence and terrorism, and that therefore what you really need to do is to get rid of Wahhabism. What I'm trying to argue is that there are some people who have engaged in violence and fanaticism in the name of Wahhabism, but they're not necessarily representative of Wahhabism as a broad interpretation of Islam, and that what needs to be encouraged are these more moderate interpreters of Wahhabism rather than people who are funneling money into terrorist activities. And I think the Saudi government has responded to these accusations and concerns, as I said, by freezing accounts going abroad, trying to establish some level of control over this kind of financing so that it's not making its way into the hands of terrorists.
I think we have
Probably wrap up.
intruded upon your voice.